Have you ever made a promise you thought you could keep, but couldn't? What if the people making the promises were worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and those broken promises affected everybody? That's what's been happening with some of the world's biggest companies. They love throwing around buzzwords like these. About half of them have made promises to go net zero in the future. But last year, hundreds of these companies didn't even come up with a proper plan to hit those targets. Others openly admitted they won't reach theirs. And that's even though, for the most part, companies' ambitions were pretty low to start with. So why is this happening, and should we believe any of these promises? But first, let's talk about what this even means. By saying they will go net zero, companies pledge not to emit more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than they remove. Scientists say we need to get there by 2050, and a lot of the companies you know have made that promise. But as you can imagine, reducing emissions is harder for some businesses than others. Office-heavy firms like insurance companies can switch to renewable energy and video calls quite easily. But airlines...
Delta is committed to net zero carbon emissions by 2050.
Or even fossil fuel companies.
Shell's target is to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner.
That's a whole different story. But the fact that actually reducing emissions is tough hasn't stopped businesses from making a bunch of lofty promises.
We're the world's first carbon-negative brewery.
Spoiler alert, they are not. So let's dissect what to look out for in a company's climate targets. The first big question, are companies really reducing emissions? A company can produce 3 different types of emissions. Let's take the fashion industry as an example. Fashion companies burn fossil fuels on site to produce their clothes and use trucks to transport them. Those are direct emissions produced by their own factory or their own vehicles. Then there are indirect emissions from the energy they buy. Those come from electricity and heating that companies rely on. And then there's the rest. Those are all other emissions, so the ones of the cotton suppliers or the emissions from shipping that cotton to a textile mill. Let's look at these first, because they are the easiest to reduce, since companies have direct control over them. Companies that make money by producing stuff, like fashion brands, can reduce their emissions by using more energy-efficient machines or transporting their goods with electric trucks. To reduce their energy emissions, they can switch to renewables. But here's the problem. To know whether a company is actually reducing emissions, you need data. And that data, depending on how it's presented, can tell very different stories.
It's probably one of the most important questions to be answered around basically eliminating creative accounting.
That's John Lang, who co-founded an organization that tracks the trustworthiness of companies' net zero promises. Take luxury fashion brand Gucci. In 2018, it pledged to produce luxury fashion without harming the environment. In its 2021 sustainability report, the company says it's been carbon neutral for years. It also says it wants to reduce 50% of its emissions by 2025. And at first glance, they are almost there. But when you look closer, you see that this graphic isn't showing their overall emissions, but their emissions relative to their revenue. Here you can see Gucci actually emitted more CO2. That's not a 46% drop, but a 36% increase, but they didn't highlight that. So Gucci emitted less CO2 per dollar it made, but more CO2 overall because its business grew, meaning it moved away from this goal. Meanwhile, Gucci seems to have changed its tune. In its 2023 report, it no longer claims to be carbon neutral. And something else changed. Gucci only lists its emissions from 2021 onwards, and it leaves out earlier years. Comparing their emissions to 2015, for example, would have painted a different picture. Planet A reached out to Gucci, but the firm did not wish to comment for this report. But a lack of transparency isn't only a Gucci problem.
If a company has pledged to go to net zero 3 years ago, they should logically have already crafted a plan to deliver on that pledge. Sometimes we're not seeing that. And if they have produced a plan, it's often loaded with strategic ambiguity, and the actual principal details are tucked away in, say, a footnote, which might be on page 114.
And then there's the big elephant in the room. Many companies have to emit greenhouse gases to do business. Without burning fossil fuels, their business model would fall apart. So they turn to a handy tool to try and meet their targets.
Companies are not being transparent, especially around their use or intended use of offsets.
So let's look at another sketchy component of companies' climate targets: carbon offsets. We have a whole video on those here. Ideally, to fulfill its climate promises, a company should reduce emissions within its own production before it looks at buying high-quality offsets to balance out the rest. But instead, most companies heavily rely on this: planting trees. Let's look at the Scottish beer brand BrewDog. In 2020, it called itself a carbon-negative beer business, saying it would remove twice as much carbon from the atmosphere as it emits. Part of BrewDog's plan? Growing a forest made up of 1 million trees to cancel out their emissions. On this plot of land in the Scottish Highlands. Plus, BrewDog says it started buying additional carbon offsets from other reforestation projects. But here's the problem with offsets. Many have been discredited. Reforestation has often turned out to be much less effective than advertised.
I want to be clear, we need forests, we need nature for realizing climate goals on a global scale.
That's Subrik Smit. She assesses companies' plans to go net zero.
But we also need rapid emission reductions. And by simply saying that with planting some trees, that you then compensate for your emissions, does not help the problem. So climate neutrality claims today, based on those measures, are really only delaying the problem.
In 2024, reports surfaced that half of the trees in BrewDog's plantation had died, and the business eventually ditched its carbon negative claim. Planet A reached out to BrewDog but did not receive a reply. Still, BrewDog is far from the only company with lofty claims that aren't backed by science or evidence. Here's Apple having a go.
To make Apple carbon neutral.
The first step, making certain models of their Apple Watch supposedly carbon neutral. It's a claim that's come under fire in the EU, where those types of statements could soon be banned. The New Climate Institute, an NGO, has criticized Apple's carbon-neutral watches as a bold exaggeration for relying on low-quality carbon offsets and for assuming that all of its producers use renewable energy. Apple did not want to go on record for this video. Carbon neutrality means a business is taking out as much carbon from the atmosphere as it's putting in. But here's the problem. This is much more of a regulated term than this, which has no universal standards. And frequently, it's based on offsetting.
Carbon neutrality claims or climate neutrality claims, they are often not based on very good measures.
BrewDog has since said it wants to prioritize decarbonizing its own production instead of spending money on buying offsets. So a lack of transparency and a focus on offsetting are hindering real progress. But there's another problem. Remember the different types of emissions? The vast majority aren't emitted here, but here. Indirect greenhouse gas emissions of a company, like those of their suppliers. Most of the time, they make up the majority of a company's footprint, so reducing them is key to getting here. But here's the problem. Most companies worldwide don't measure or set targets for those emissions because it's very tricky to do.
They don't have direct control of those emissions. But what they can do is they can work proactively with their suppliers.
That's what Walmart's Gigaton project does, for example. It offers support to its suppliers to tackle their emissions in areas like energy or waste. H&M has launched a similar program, providing affordable loans so its supplying factories can switch to renewable energy.
And for me, that's one of the most important things that companies can do, is try and influence beyond their direct control what others are doing around reducing emissions.
So, just like me, companies are struggling to hit the bullseye. Last year, only 1 in 6 of the world's largest companies were on track to reaching net zero by 2050, a decline from the year before. Of all the different industries, insurance is the one with the highest share of companies on track. The fashion industry is way down at the bottom within consumer goods, behind travel and airlines. So how are big emitters meant to get here? First, by trying to cut any emissions that they can in their own operations. If they are serious about this, that may mean changing entire business models. Like Danish company Ørsted, which used to sell coal-powered energy, now it's one of the leading offshore wind businesses. Second, they need to cut their accounting BS.
The voluntary community and regulators are starting to lock these corporates in a lot of their greenwash in their sites. And the corporates are obviously aware of that now.
For example, since 2023, the European Union has required larger companies to provide information on their direct and indirect emissions and clear reduction targets.
So now companies actually have to present real data and have to back up their data with their methodologies, and also have to get their data checked by third parties.
Next, they have to stop making misleading greenwashing claims. The EU will be banning any claims that aren't backed by evidence, and offsetting doesn't count. The UK and Australia have taken similar steps. And that Brewdog ad?
As we're the world's first carbon-negative brewery, and plant trees for every beer you drink.
It was taken down because of stricter regulation in the UK. More oversight from both policymakers and civil society means we have moved to what John Lang calls a new phase of net zero.
And now we're at the tricky part, where corporates are turning their attention to the how of net zero. And this is a much trickier phase. Many corporates didn't know what they were signing up for. They knew net zero, but what did that actually involve?
Don't get me wrong, most companies are still putting short-term profits ahead of our long-term survival, but it's also become harder for them to hide behind empty words. So they will have to start taking meaningful steps towards net zero. How do you think businesses should reduce their carbon footprint? Please let us know in the comments, subscribe, and check out more information on dw.com.